Case 1. Kirk Franklin. Kirk Franklin sat beneath studio lights, his voice low and steady, as he admitted something that millions of gospel listeners never imagined. He told the world that long before he was a chart-topping artist, long before Stomp blasted through church youth groups and award stages, he had carried a secret addiction that nearly destroyed everything he built. In a confessional interview that would become one of the most discussed moments in modern gospel culture, he said plainly, "I was addicted to pornography for years." There was no dramatic music, no preacher's cadence, just a man describing a private darkness that lived underneath a public ministry built on joy, unity, and family worship. To understand the shock of that moment, you have to understand where Kirk Franklin stood in gospel history. He wasn't just another choir director, he was the face of contemporary gospel in the late 1990s and early 2000s. A crossover superstar whose sound reshaped Christian music forever. He won Grammy Awards, sold millions of records, and led sold-out tours where entire arenas sang about hope, redemption, and spiritual discipline. He became a trusted voice in Christian households, the artist pastors recommended to young people, a symbol of faith done right. But all the while, Franklin later admitted, he was living a secret double life, sneaking away to satisfy an addiction he couldn't control. In interviews, he described pornography as a drug, something that rewired his brain, sabotaged intimacy, and slowly poisoned his marriage from the inside. At first, the struggle stayed invisible. Kirk managed to keep it hidden through success, travel, studio sessions, and church events. He was celebrated by pastors and platforms that preached against sexual sin, while privately drowning in the exact temptation those sermons warned about. He told stories of deleting files only to download them again hours later, of hiding magazines and later streaming videos in moments when he should have been with family, and of convincing himself he could quit whenever he wanted. The addiction wasn't a casual vice. It was compulsion, secrecy, shame, and a cycle that tightened its grip year after year. The turning point finally came not through a church intervention or a public scandal, but through a breaking moment at home. Kirk Franklin's wife discovered evidence of his habit and confronted him. That confrontation forced him to stop pretending he could handle it alone. He described sitting in therapy, confessing his habits to counselors, withdrawing from triggers, and dismantling the lies he built to protect his image. By the time his admission reached national television, the private struggle had already been raging for years. When the confession aired on Oprah and in magazine interviews, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some fans were stunned, confused that the man who wrote worship anthems had lived with such a secret. Others found strength in his honesty, because he refused to wrap it in religious language or minimize the damage it caused. Churches debated whether his career would survive, whether his ministry could continue, whether he was disqualified because he hadn't followed the purity image audiences assumed he represented. But Kirk Franklin did something rare in gospel culture. He didn't vanish. Instead, he chose transparency, accountability, and slow recovery. The fallout from his confession didn't end his music, but it changed how people heard it. Songs about grace and deliverance suddenly had a different weight coming from someone who admitted he'd almost lost everything behind closed doors. His story became a doorway into larger conversations about addiction, trauma, and the hidden battles behind polished Sunday performances. It was a reminder that even those singing about freedom can be living in chains, and that exposure isn't always humiliation. Sometimes it's the start of healing. Welcome to Savage Case Files. Here, we document the hidden battles behind the spotlight, the stories nobody wanted to tell, and the realities that shattered images built over decades. If you're someone who genuinely cares about truth and you want more in-depth documentary-style breakdowns like this one every single day, do one simple thing that makes a massive difference. Subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, but your subscription tells us that these stories matter, that honesty matters, and that exposing the gap between the platform and the person is worth the work it takes to research and produce these episodes. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and let's continue, because what comes next will show you just how deep these hidden struggles really go. Case 2. Michael English. Long before his name became synonymous with one of gospel music's most public collapses, Michael English stood at the peak of contemporary Christian fame. He was a Dove Award magnate, a marquee voice on Gaither tours, the kind of artist whose tone could fill arenas and pull entire congregations into worship. To audiences across America, he looked like the perfect testimony. Handsome, humble, spirit-filled, and professionally unstoppable. But behind the smooth vocals and devotional lyrics was a life spiraling under the weight of secret habits and hidden pain, a private world built on prescription medication and self-destructive choices that would detonate his career in a way the gospel industry had rarely seen before. The breaking point came in 1994. What began as whispers in tight ministry circles suddenly exploded into national Christian media. Michael English admitted to an extramarital affair with another prominent gospel artist, and almost instantly the scandal pulled the curtain up on much more than infidelity. What hadn't been visible to fans was how deeply prescription drugs had tangled themselves into his daily routine. Pills to sleep, pills to function, pills to escape the guilt of the life he was pretending to manage. In his memoir, The Prodigal Comes Home, English described addiction not as something he stepped into overnight, but as a slow crawl, one prescription after another, until denial became a second language and shame became a full-time job. As sponsors pulled away and radio stations erased his tracks from rotation, the gospel industry responded with cold precision. The Dove Awards committee did something almost unheard of. It rescinded multiple awards he had just won. Concert bookings evaporated, record contracts dissolved. The golden boy of contemporary Christian music became a cautionary tale nearly overnight. Fans who once sang his lyrics about redemption now watched as the industry tried to erase him from its memory, as if pretending he never existed could somehow protect its image. But addiction doesn't disappear because a career collapses. In fact, in Michael's case, the collapse amplified it. He fled deeper into prescription drug use, self-punishment, and a haze of regret that he later described as a living death. For years, he disappeared from the stage and from the public. No spotlight, no applause, no packed arenas. Just the long, messy work of figuring out whether there was anything left worth saving. Slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. Rehab became routine. Church became a lifeline instead of a platform. He tried to repair the relationships that had been quietly bleeding behind the scenes for years. His comeback didn't look anything like the first peak of his career. No flash, no Dove Awards, no immaculate public image. Just small rooms, honest conversations, and a voice that now sang from a place of transparency rather than perfection. Michael English never fully returned to the level of stardom he once knew, and maybe he never wanted to. His name remains stamped with scandal in gospel history, but his story endures because addiction is rarely neat, rarely pretty, and never as simple as public downfall headlines make it seem. For many of his early fans, his testimony today, stripped of fame and facades, has become more powerful than any award he ever won. Case 3. James Fortune. James Fortune built his name on songs about grace, breakthrough, and overcoming struggle. His voice carried across gospel radio every night, offering comfort to families and believers who trusted him as one of the most authentic storytellers in modern worship music. But while listeners heard inspiration in his lyrics, his private life was spiraling under the weight of addiction, anger, and dependency that would repeatedly explode into the public eye. The most devastating moment came in 2014, when headlines announced his arrest for aggravated assault involving a family member. For many, it was the first time they saw a crack in the polished image. For others, it was a brutal confirmation of rumors they hoped weren't true. Police reports detailed what happened: a violent confrontation fueled by alcohol and uncontrolled rage that forced the world to confront a side of Fortune they had never been allowed to see. When Fortune later spoke publicly about the incident, he didn't try to hide behind excuses or soft language. He admitted that alcohol had controlled him in ways he didn't fully understand, and that his temper, once a private enemy, had become a destructive force capable of harming those closest to him. What shocked fans wasn't just the crime, it was the confession. He acknowledged that anger had been part of his personality long before success, long before the radio show and the Grammy nominations. It had been simmering quietly beneath years of public ministry, and once alcohol became a coping tool, it made the worst version of himself impossible to contain. The admission turned what had been a headline into a national gospel conversation about addiction that hides behind achievement. The backlash was immediate. Stations dropped his music, promoters pulled him from concert lineups, sponsorships evaporated. Gospel insiders, who had once celebrated him, now struggled to reconcile the man behind hits like I Believe and Live Through It with the mugshot circulating online. Fortune was forced to step back from the spotlight and confront the consequences: court appearances, mandated treatment, and the quiet fallout within the gospel industry created a long stretch of silence, the kind that ends careers entirely. But as months passed, something unexpected began to happen. Fortune continued to speak, not to defend himself, but to confront the addiction publicly. He talked openly about therapy, recovery programs, the painful work of trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness, and how sobriety is a daily battle, not a single decision. It didn't erase the crime, it didn't undo the harm, but it changed the conversation around him. Instead of disappearing, Fortune shifted into a different kind of voice, one that talked about accountability, humility, and healing in a way that gospel music rarely addresses. Slowly, producers invited him back, radio shows cautiously welcomed him, for discussions rather than celebrations, and audiences, divided as they were, could see that every performance now carried weight that hadn't been there before. His career never returned to the spotless image it once had, but it evolved into something more complicated, a journey of public confession and slow reconstruction. James Fortune's story is not a clean redemption arc or a clear downfall. It is a collision of talent and trauma, faith and addiction, fame and failure. He lost nearly everything: airplay, endorsements, credibility, but fought to confront the demons that fueled the collapse. In many ways, he remains a symbol of a wider truth within gospel culture. Even inside the world that sings about victory over sin, secret struggles can sit right behind the microphone, waiting for a moment of crisis to explode into view. Case 4. Leandria Johnson. When Leandria Johnson won Season 3 of BET's Sunday Best, she wasn't just another talented singer. She was hailed as one of the most powerful voices of her generation. She came from a deep church family with a testimony that resonated through every run and every lyric. But as her songs climbed gospel radio charts and she stood under bright stage lights belting praises to God, something far darker was tightening around her life in private. Alcohol wasn't a social habit or a stress relief. It became her secret engine, the thing she leaned on when the applause ended and the expectations started crushing in. For years, Leandria tried to hide it. She would show up to recording sessions late, visibly exhausted, her voice worn from nights she couldn't remember. Industry insiders whispered, promoters made excuses, and fans noticed her disappearing from concerts with flimsy explanations. And then came the moment everything broke wide open: her appearance on Iyanla Fix My Life. Sitting across from Iyanla Van Zant, Leandria didn't sugarcoat anything. She admitted, trembling and raw, that alcohol had consumed her life, that she was drinking almost every day, numbing emotions she didn't want to face. Millions of viewers watched her say out loud what her closest friends already knew: She was falling apart. The confession wasn't sensational, it was heartbreaking. She talked about drinking before performances, hiding bottles around her house, and spiraling so hard that she alienated those she loved most. She said success came too quickly, and instead of feeling chosen, she felt crushed by expectations. And while critics attacked her online, many supporters recognized a painful truth. Gospel platforms often demand perfection, leaving artists nowhere to be honest, nowhere safe to say, "I'm drowning." The fallout was immediate. Major tour organizers removed her from lineups, corporate gospel circles distanced themselves. She was viewed as unpredictable, too much drama, someone with a great gift who couldn't be trusted on stage. Superstar gospel singers who once called her sister stopped answering calls, and in a devastating low point, Leandria publicly went live on social media several times while intoxicated, airing grievances against churches, pastors, and the industry itself. It was messy, it was ugly, it was real. Every clip went viral, and every one of them deepened her isolation. But even in the middle of collapse, a story emerged that mattered. Leandria didn't vanish. She sought treatment. She confronted her past and started speaking openly about addiction, trauma, and mental health, in a genre terrified to admit either exists. She stopped pretending. When she returned to music, her voice sounded different, not weaker, but weathered in a way gospel rarely allows. There were scars in the sound, broken places in the lyrics, and honesty that cut deeper than sanitized Christian cliché. Leandria Johnson never tried to rebuild the perfect gospel image again. She built something more human. Today, she still performs, still records, and still lives with awareness of a struggle she says will never fully disappear. She is not a redemption story tied up neatly with a bow. She is a reminder that behind every choir robe, every award, every Grammy-winning vocal run, there can be hidden bottles, hidden pain, hidden addictions the church doesn't want to acknowledge. And in that sense, Leandria's downfall wasn't just her story. It was a mirror the gospel industry had no choice but to look into. Case 5. Deitrick Haddon. Long before reality TV cameras ever followed him into living rooms across America, Deitrick Haddon had already built a reputation as one of gospel music's most electrifying voices. His songwriting cut through church cliches and brought an honesty that resonated with young believers. He preached purity from pulpits, sang about holiness, and embodied a fast-rising next-generation gospel image. But behind the confident stage presence and the polished albums was a personal life tearing itself apart. What looked like simple moral failure on tabloid headlines was, according to Haddon himself, the manifestation of a long-running sex addiction and destructive behavior pattern that would eventually cost him everything he thought made him a man of God. The unraveling began quietly, hidden in late-night messages, secret relationships, and moments of impulsive choices that spiraled far beyond what he could control. While married and pastoring, Haddon started an affair, which led to a pregnancy outside his marriage. He concealed it for a time, trying to reconcile public ministry with private chaos, but secrets never stay buried. The truth finally erupted in 2013 on national television. When Preachers of LL debuted on the Oxygen network, Deitrick did something few gospel artists had ever done. He openly confessed, on camera, to adultery and fathering a child while still a preacher. What millions of churchgoers assumed was a sudden scandal had actually been a long, hidden struggle, years of trying to break a cycle of compulsion and shame he later described as an addiction to validation and unhealthy intimacy. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Haddon resigned from his church position, friends and mentors cut ties. Critics accused him of exploiting transparency for ratings. Headlines were merciless, and congregations who once celebrated him suddenly questioned everything: his sermons, his sincerity, his calling. Church elders issued statements of concern, and gospel insiders whispered that his career was finished. The scandal didn't just cost him status. It shattered his first marriage and forced him into a long public reckoning with what addiction can do to someone who is supposed to be a symbol of purity. But somewhere in the wreckage, Haddon made a decision not to run from the narrative. He leaned into it. In interviews, he stopped trying to present himself as a victim of circumstance. He began saying the words out loud. "I was addicted to sex. I made terrible choices. I broke trust." He remarried, and slowly, a different version of Deitrick started to emerge. One who wasn't hiding. One who wasn't trying so hard to fit an image of flawless gospel perfection. Instead, he became increasingly vocal about grace, second chances, trauma, and the quiet compartments of shame that pastors hide because they fear losing their whole world if anyone ever sees the truth. Today, Deitrick Haddon is still recording, still preaching, and still appearing in public conversations about healing. He's no longer protected by the illusion of moral invincibility. In fact, he refuses it. His music carries the weight of someone who has lived through exposure and survived it. But the lesson of his downfall, for many who watched him, remains sobering. When a pastor stands on a stage condemning lust, addiction, and sexual brokenness, it's easy to assume he's speaking from moral superiority. In Deitrick's case, he was speaking from the center of a battle he was losing behind closed doors. And when that battle finally spilled into public view, it left scars not just on his legacy, but across the gospel community that once saw him as the future of purity and praise. Case 6. Tonex, B. Slade. For a long time, Tonex was gospel's unapologetic prodigy, a wildly gifted singer, producer, and performer whose creativity seemed limitless. His voice could move effortlessly from a soft falsetto to a raw, anguished cry that sounded like someone shaking the walls of a sanctuary. Fans saw him as the future of gospel, a lightning bolt of innovation in a genre often trapped inside tradition. But away from the stage, he was fighting a private war that most people never saw. Addiction didn't look like a bottle or a needle in his case. It looked like running from silence, drowning in lifestyle excess, and using anything available to numb the mounting pressure of being a perfect gospel star. In interviews years later, Tonex described it as living two lives, the public image of spiritual excellence and the private reality of loneliness, depression, and self-medication disguised as constant movement. The collapse began in whispers, canceled shows, rumors of behavior that didn't match the pulpit persona, unexplained disappearances from industry events. Tonex would later speak openly about the period when he was spiraling through nightlife, impulsive spending, compulsive relationships, and documented struggles with depression. He admitted that he coped with the intense scrutiny of the gospel world by numbing himself with whatever distraction he could find. Gospel insiders knew something was wrong long before the public did, but the industry's unwritten rule has always been simple. Keep quiet, keep performing, keep making money. Tonex tried. He pushed himself harder, recorded more music, and pretended everything was fine. But addiction eventually exposes itself. The breaking point came when he could no longer maintain the image. Interviews became raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. He spoke candidly about depression and destructive patterns and about how gospel culture can punish authenticity. The backlash was immediate. Concert promoters backed away. Christian radio distanced itself. Church leaders who once praised his genius suddenly treated him like a liability. Tonex went from award-winning hitmaker to industry exile almost overnight, not because he lacked talent, but because he dared to tell the truth about the mess behind the music. He disappeared for a while, but reinvention became survival. He changed his name to B. Slade and stepped outside the gospel machine altogether. He began releasing music independently, collaborating with mainstream artists, producing for others, and redefining his identity on his own terms. It wasn't a miracle recovery story tied with a bow. It was slow, imperfect, and still ongoing. Addiction doesn't vanish because someone admits it. It becomes a companion you manage, not a monster you magically defeat. Today, when people talk about Tonex, they talk about two legacies: the gospel pioneer who blew open the aesthetic of church music, and the man who lived through a collapse many in the industry quietly understand but never acknowledge. His story remains a warning and a window, proof that talent and acclaim don't cure inner turmoil, and that hiding addiction behind worship lyrics only delays the moment when everything cracks. Case 7. Mandisa. Sarah Mandisa had one of the most iconic voices to ever emerge from gospel music's intersection with mainstream pop culture. Millions first met her as a powerhouse vocalist on American Idol, a contestant whose radiant positivity and bold faith made her unforgettable. But audiences only saw what the cameras allowed them to see: the bright smile, the church girl confidence, the voice that could shake stadium walls. What happened off stage was far darker, and it nearly cost her everything, including her career, her health, and her will to keep living. Her trouble didn't start with fame. It started with pressure. As Mandisa's visibility grew, so did the demands from the music industry, the church community, and her growing fan base. She felt expected to stay strong, happy, and spiritually victorious all the time. What nobody knew was that she was fighting a war inside herself. Years later, she admitted she turned to alcohol and food, not for pleasure, but for survival. They became both medication and punishment, a way to numb anxiety and shame. The addiction didn't explode overnight. It crept in quietly, disguised as coping mechanisms, and before long, her relationship with substances became something she could no longer control. At her lowest point, Mandisa disappeared nearly completely from public view. Concerts were canceled, interviews declined, social media went silent, friends said calls went unanswered for long stretches of time, rumors started circulating through the gospel industry. Some thought she had simply burned out. Others suspected creative conflict, but the truth, eventually revealed in her brutally honest memoir, Out of the Dark, was much more painful. She had isolated in her home, to the point that she barely left her couch. Depression, fueled by unresolved trauma, shame, and addictive habits, swallowed her whole. During this period of withdrawal, addiction took on a life of its own. Mandisa described hiding bottles, binge drinking late into the night, and using food as both comfort and punishment. Most terrifying of all, she admitted she no longer cared whether she woke up in the morning. Her disappearance from music wasn't just a career break, it was a survival freeze response, a collapse of self that nearly ended her life, and the people closest to her were left scared, confused, and unsure if she would ever return. The turning point came when a small circle of loved ones staged an intervention, not dramatic like television rehab scenes, but quiet and persistent. A friend showed up on her doorstep and refused to leave until she opened the door. Others continued calling, praying, and pushing her gently back into community. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Mandisa went through counseling, recovery steps, medication, and a long, slow unraveling of secrecy. In interviews, she says grace came not in one supernatural burst, but in a series of small human lifelines that pulled her out of isolation. When she returned to music, she didn't return as the same person. She performed again, not because she was fixed, but because she was finally honest. In church conferences and televised interviews, she began speaking publicly about addiction, depression, and the silent pain so many Christians hide. The scandal wasn't lurid like others on this list. There was no arrest, no tabloid explosion. But the downfall was just as real, because it destroyed Mandisa from the inside, and her recovery has become just as public as her collapse. Today, Mandisa's voice carries something different, a testimony marked by scars rather than perfection. Her story is messy, complicated, deeply human. She didn't lose everything forever, but she came dangerously close. In sharing her truth, she exposed a reality nobody in gospel culture likes to admit. Sometimes the brightest voices on stage are the ones fighting the darkest battles when the lights go out. Case 8. Courtney Wilson. At the height of his career, Courtney Wilson was known for a voice that felt like prayer set to melody. Smooth, honest, deeply rooted in hope. Songs like All I Need and Worth Fighting For became anthems in churches across the country, and his calm, steady demeanor made him look like someone untouched by personal turmoil. Which is why the truth hit so hard when Wilson began openly sharing that he had been wrestling for years with a hidden porn addiction, a struggle that nearly tore apart the very life he sang about saving. In conference panels and candid interviews, he described how he would walk onto a stage on Sunday morning carrying shame from Saturday night, trying to lead worship while feeling like a man quietly drowning. His vulnerability, when it finally surfaced, left listeners stunned, because Wilson was never one of gospel's loud or controversial personalities. He was respected, quiet, safe. That made the confession even more jarring. Wilson didn't sugarcoat what happened. He admitted that the addiction started as an escape, a coping mechanism for stress, loneliness, and unresolved anxiety, but eventually grew into a secret cycle that controlled his habits, disrupted his creativity, and filled him with fear of discovery. He talked about the double life, public ministry built on singing about faithfulness, private moments marked by guilt and self-loathing. The breaking point came when his marriage began to show cracks he could no longer ignore. His wife saw the emotional distance, the mood swings, the shame that always seemed to sit behind his eyes. Wilson later said that he came to realize addiction isn't just about the substance or the habit. It's about the devastation of intimacy, communication, and honesty in the relationships closest to you. Once he decided to stop hiding, the fallout started quietly but powerfully. He stepped back from touring for a season, canceled several appearances, and entered personal counseling. In one church interview, he described sitting in a room with other men, pastors, deacons, worship leaders, and hearing them confess the same struggle he thought he was fighting alone. That moment changed him. It wasn't instant healing, but it was the beginning of pulling his private pain into the light. Wilson credited therapy, accountability partners, and spiritual mentoring for showing him that recovery is made of small, consistent choices, not one dramatic breakthrough. The gospel industry's response was mixed. Unlike some cases on this list, Wilson didn't face scandal tabloids or public humiliation. His transparency protected him from the scandal cycle, but it still cost him momentum. There were projects paused, tours pushed, and a noticeable disappearance from mainstream gospel radio for a while. He later explained that stepping away was necessary. You can't sing freedom to others while living in chains yourself. When he returned, his music took on a deeper tone. Lyrics started to feel more confessional, more human, less polished. Fans noticed. Many said his later work carried a kind of honesty that only comes from having walked through fire. Courtney Wilson didn't lose everything. He nearly did. And that almost became the lesson he now speaks about openly. His case stands out on this list because it wasn't driven by exposure from headlines or investigative reporting. It was exposure by choice. And in a genre where image, perfection, and spiritual strength are expected, he decided to become a witness to weakness instead. His story is not about public downfall, but about a private battle, shattering the myth that talent and ministry somehow protect a person from addiction. It's a reminder that hidden struggles don't disappear just because someone has a microphone, and that sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't a lyric, but the willingness to tell the truth when everything in you wants to keep silent. Case 9. Donnie McClurkin. In a quiet TBN studio, under soft lighting and a calm, almost reverent atmosphere, Donnie McClurkin sits in the kind of chair usually reserved for triumphant testimonies and victory stories. But this time, his voice isn't booming in song or preaching with authority. It's lower, slower, weighed down by something heavier than any note he's ever held on stage. Looking straight into the camera, he begins to talk about a battle most people never imagined he was fighting. One not with demons on the outside, but with desires and images that tormented him in private. He admits, in front of a Christian television audience that has sung along to Stand and We Fall Down for years, that he has struggled deeply with sexual addiction and pornography. It's a confession that cuts straight through the polished image many had of him as the poster child for deliverance and holiness, and it instantly reframes every sermon, every lyric, every altar call he's ever led about purity and freedom. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand where he came from. Long before the Dove Awards, Grammy recognition, and international tours, Donnie McClurkin was a wounded kid from Queens, New York, trying to survive trauma that would follow him well into adulthood. He has spoken openly about being sexually abused as a child, first by a male family friend, then by an older relative. Those experiences didn't just leave scars. They shaped how he saw himself, how he related to his own body, and how he understood intimacy, shame, and identity. Church became both a refuge and a stage. The music gave him language to reach for God, and the platform gave him purpose. As his voice started carrying him from local choirs to global arenas, he crafted a public ministry heavily focused on victory, deliverance, and overcoming sin. But behind the scenes, the unresolved pain from his childhood never truly went away. As his fame grew, so did the pressure to embody the very message he preached. He became a symbol of overcoming, someone who talked about deliverance from sexual brokenness and the power of God to heal what others said could never be fixed. Yet in private, he found himself drawn back again and again to pornography, using it as a coping mechanism, a way to manage stress, loneliness, and the echoes of that early trauma. What started as a secret indulgence became a cycle: watch, feel guilty, repent, promise God it would never happen again, and then, in a moment of weakness, return to the same dark well. This wasn't the story of a man casually dabbling in sin. It was the story of someone caught in a tug-of-war between deep personal pain and the impossible expectations of public ministry. By the time he sat in that TBN studio confessing his struggles, Donnie knew exactly what he was risking. In the world he came from, church people don't handle sexual honesty well, especially when it comes from leaders. There was always the possibility that speaking so bluntly about pornography and sexual addiction would cost him bookings, respect, maybe even his career. But the alternative, continuing to live a double life, was slowly eating him alive. So he laid it all out. The temptations, the repeated failures, the nights of tears and prayer, the confusion of preaching victory while feeling defeated behind closed doors. He didn't frame it as a neat, completed story with a bow on top. He described it as a battle, one he was still in, one that didn't always have clean, churchy answers. The fallout was complicated. Some people were deeply disappointed, struggling to reconcile the vulnerability of his confession with the image they had of him as a near-flawless worship leader. Others accused him of hypocrisy, pointing to his messages about holiness and deliverance as evidence that he should have known better. But there was also another response. Quiet, less visible, but just as real. Countless people who had carried their own secret addictions and hidden habits heard his words and finally felt seen. If someone as respected, as anointed, and as successful as Donnie McClurkin could admit this struggle, maybe they weren't beyond help either. In the years since, Donnie has tried to turn his worst battles into a kind of roadmap for others. He still speaks about deliverance and holiness, but now his words carry a different tone. Less distant, less theoretical, more grounded in the mess of real life. He talks about counseling, accountability, and the long, slow work of healing from childhood trauma. His reputation has undeniably taken hits. Not everyone knows what to do with a leader who refuses to pretend his fight is over. Yet, for many, that honesty has become part of his legacy. He is no longer just the man who sang about getting back up after falling. He is the man who actually admitted how hard the fall can be, and how much courage it takes to stand in front of the world and say, "This is where I'm broken, and this is where I'm still trusting God to fix me." Case 10, Jessica Reedy. Jessica Reedy's voice was one of the purest and most promising in modern gospel. When she first stepped onto national television as a contestant on BET's Sunday Best, there was something almost angelic about her presence. Audiences connected instantly to a tone that felt wounded yet hopeful, humble yet impossibly strong. She moved through songs like she was living them in real time, every lyric shaped by a story she rarely talked about. But behind the early success, the award nominations, the hit singles, the glowing industry praise, Jessica was quietly losing her grip. Her addiction wasn't the sensational kind tabloids rush to print. It was a quieter storm, leaning on substances and emotional numbing just to make it through the long nights of depression and fear that fame had amplified instead of cured. What made her situation so heartbreaking was how sudden the shift seemed to fans. One moment, she was everywhere, performing on television, showing up at industry events, releasing records with some of the biggest names in gospel. Then suddenly she was gone, disappearing from tours, canceling appearances, dropping off social media for months at a time. Rumors swirled, but none of them spoke to the real truth. Reedy wasn't running from fame, she was fighting for her life. She later admitted that she depended on substances, not to get high or chase euphoria, but to disconnect long enough to keep going. The pressure to be strong, saved, and always blessed crushed her, especially when the cameras turned off and silence crept in. What exposed her struggle wasn't a scandal, an arrest, or a courtroom headline. It was her own courage. Jessica began telling her story in televised interviews and testimonies, describing how addiction could hide behind a smile, behind worship lyrics, behind Instagram posts declaring victory in Jesus. She spoke about long nights spent crying alone, using whatever she could find to numb her body, just enough to let her mind rest. She explained how she felt trapped by expectations, not just from fans, but from the gospel industry itself, which often prizes perfection over honesty. Addiction, she said, was how she coped with trauma she never learned to process. Once she went public, the impact on her career was immediate. Radio airplay slowed, industry calls went silent, invitations stopped arriving, record labels looking for marketable joy quietly moved on. Supporters who once celebrated her talent backed away without explanation. In gospel music, transparency is celebrated only when it fits a neat redemption arc, not when someone is still in the middle of their battle. Reedy wasn't offering a comeback testimony tied in a bow. She was telling the truth as it was happening, still vulnerable, still healing, still unsure. And that honesty cost her. But out of everything she lost, she says the one thing she regained was her peace. Jessica chose to step back from chasing stages and focus on her mental health and restoration. She began speaking more openly about counseling, therapy, accountability partners, and the faith practices that helped her slowly rebuild, without pretending to be perfect. Today, she releases new music on her own terms, prioritizes emotional wellness over industry pressure, and continues to share her journey with transparency that resonates deeply with those fighting their own hidden battles. Her story closes this list on a different note, not a dramatic downfall or a moral headline, but a quiet, ongoing recovery. A reminder that addiction doesn't always announce itself with scandalous explosions. Sometimes it's a whisper behind a beautiful voice, a battle being fought in the shadows, and a life slowly, painfully learning how to come back to the light. Some gospel journeys crash in public courtrooms, while others unravel in quiet living rooms when the truth finally breaks through the denial. Addiction doesn't care about platform, radio spins, Grammy statues, or Sunday morning charisma. It moves in silence, grows in secret, and eventually demands repayment in the form of reputation, relationships, and peace of mind. As we've seen tonight, some of these artists lost everything in a matter of weeks. Contracts dissolved, families fractured, tours canceled, and their names dragged through headlines they never imagined would define them. Others took years to admit what they were running from, disappearing from the spotlight, hiding behind church politics, therapy, rehab, or pure isolation before finding the strength to tell the truth. And a few didn't just confess, they rebuilt. They clawed their way back from shame and relapse to become advocates for healing in spaces that rarely admit struggle out loud. But here's the irony that sits beneath every story in this episode. Gospel music is built on redemption. It's built on testimonies, battles, failures, and comebacks. And yet, for a long time in this industry, addiction was the one subject no one dared to discuss. Singers could spend hours telling audiences about the power of deliverance, but behind tour buses and studio sessions, real deliverance often had to start with honesty no one wanted to face. These 10 lives prove one uncomfortable truth: success can hide suffering, and talent can cover trauma for only so long. Behind the anointing and applause, there were pills, bottles, secrets, shame, and the long nights of facing it alone. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these stories shocked you the most? And why do you think it is so hard for faith communities to talk honestly about addiction? Is it fear of judgment, fear of losing influence, or something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations matter more than views, more than algorithms, and more than any chart position. And if you appreciate the work we do here, shining a light in corners people would rather ignore, make sure you subscribe to Savage Case Files. It doesn't cost you anything, but it tells the platform that this content matters, and it gives us the support to keep producing high-quality true crime and faith industry exposés every single day. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay locked in, because the next story is already on the way.